The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web. But what happens when a mind is torn from the end of its own story and thrown back into the beginning? Mustafar burned in his memory. The suit, the betrayal, Obi-Wan's blade and the river of fire that had taken his legs, his arm, his face, everything but the hate. That hate had outlived the body that carried it, had followed him through 20 years of black armor and mechanized breath, all the way to a moment he didn't understand and couldn't explain. Then it was gone. All of it. The weight of the suit, the rasp of the respirator, the phantom ache where limbs used to be. Gone, replaced by something worse in its own way. Lightness. A body that breathed on its own. Lungs that didn't wheeze through a vocoder. Hands, 2 of them, flesh and blood, trembling as they gripped a rocky outcropping on a world he didn't recognize. He opened his eyes. 2 suns hung low over a canyon of red stone, and for one disorienting heartbeat, he thought he was back on Tatooine, back in the sand of his childhood. Then the details sharpened. Not Tatooine. A moon in the outer rim, its sky streaked with the smoke of distant artillery fire. Blaster bolts cracked somewhere below the ridge. Clone troopers were shouting orders in the clipped cadence of early war deployment, a cadence he hadn't heard in decades, back when the men still called each other by name instead of number. He looked down at his hands. Young hands. A Padawan's braid hung against his shoulder, sweat damp and tangled with grit. No. The thought arrived not in panic, but in the cold, assessing calm he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Vader's calm, laid now over a body that had no business housing it. He was Anakin Skywalker again. Not in memory, not in some Force vision meant to torment him. In the flesh. 19, maybe 20, standing on a battlefield that predated the Empire, predated the suit, predated everything he had become, predated everything he had done. Somewhere in the smoke below, a familiar voice called his name. Anakin, get down now. Obi-Wan Kenobi crested the ridge in a low crouch, lightsaber humming blue in his hand, robes scorched at the hem from a near miss. Younger, unlined, his beard hadn't yet gone the shade of gray Anakin remembered from later, from a memory that hadn't happened yet, wouldn't happen for years, might never happen at all now that. He didn't finish the thought. There wasn't time. A droid gunship screamed overhead, cannons chattering, an old instinct. Instinct built over decades in a black suit, refined in 100 duels no living being in this canyon had witnessed yet, took over before conscious thought could catch up. He dropped, rolled, came up with his own lightsaber already ignited, and deflected 3 bolts back into the tree line without breaking stride. Obi-Wan blinked at him, just for a fraction of a second, but Anakin caught it, because Anakin had spent 20 years learning to read every flicker of doubt on a face, mostly because his own life had depended on hiding his. That was a new move, Obi-Wan said, ducking beside him as they both pressed against the rock face. Since when do you deflect blind? Since I did it in the dark of a suit with a targeting scope for 40 years, he didn't say. Instead, lucky guess. It wasn't a lie so much as the smallest possible fraction of the truth, and it tasted strange in his mouth. Strange the way every word out of this young throat felt strange, unpracticed, wrong-shaped for a mind that had learned to speak through mechanical filters and sit formality. He had to relearn how to be Anakin, not perform him, actually inhabit him moment to moment, in front of a man whose entire skill set was built around sensing exactly this kind of lie. The gunship banked for another pass. Below, in the smoke, clone troopers dug in against a wave of B-1 battle droids pouring out of a separatist landing craft. A battle Anakin recognized now, dimly, through the fog of a memory he'd never lived firsthand. Not this exact engagement, but its shape. Early Clone Wars, a contested Outer Rim world. A separatist push meant to test the Republic's supply lines before a larger offensive. He knew, with the sick certainty of hindsight, how badly undermanned this position was. He knew the droid reinforcements arriving in 6 minutes from the Eastern Ridge. He knew that in the timeline he remembered, assuming this was that timeline, assuming any of this was real, and not some force-fevered dream at the edge of death on Mustafar. 3 clone troopers died holding this exact position, and a 4th lost his legs to a droideka that flanked from the canyon floor. He knew because he had read the reports once, decades later, filed away in an Imperial archive he'd barely glanced at. Vader hadn't cared about dead clones. Vader had burned that archive along with 1,000 others when Order 66 made the whole army disposable. Anakin's jaw tightened. Whatever he was, whoever he was, now in this stolen or returned or reborn moment, he was not going to watch that happen again without trying to stop it. Eastern Ridge, he said, already moving. Droidekas incoming, maybe 6 minutes. We pull back the forward squad now, dig a secondary line at the rock shelf, and we don't lose anyone doing it. Obi-Wan stared at him. A longer look this time. The kind of look a Jedi Master gives a Padawan who has just spoken with the tactical certainty of a general twice his age. How could you possibly know that? Anakin felt the old mask try to settle over his face out of pure habit, the flat, unreadable calm that had made 1,000 officers flinch on the bridge of a Star Destroyer. He forced it down, forced something looser, younger. Anakin shaped into its place. Instinct, he said. The Force. Call it whatever you want, Master. We don't have 6 minutes to argue about it. Something in his tone must have carried enough weight, because Obi-Wan didn't argue. He keyed his comlink and barked orders down to the clone captain below, and within 90 seconds the forward squad was falling back exactly as Anakin had said they should. And within 5 minutes the droideka flanking maneuver hit a position that had already been reinforced. And within 10 minutes, 3 men who should have died in a footnote nobody ever read were instead very much alive, cursing and reloading behind a rock shelf that hadn't been part of the original defense. Anakin stood at the new line, blade extinguished, breathing hard in a body that still felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone he used to be, someone he might still become, someone he was no longer certain he had any power to stop. Behind him, Obi-Wan hadn't moved. He was watching Anakin with an expression that mixed relief and something else, something wary, something that hadn't existed between them an hour ago, and now sat in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Anakin, he said quietly, what aren't you telling me? Everything, Anakin thought. Every single thing. Later, he said instead, and turned back toward the ridge, toward a war he now knew the ending of, toward a galaxy that had no idea what had just woken up inside one of its own suns. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The transport back to Coruscant took 3 days, and Anakin spent most of them relearning how to sleep. Not the mechanized half-consciousness Vader had endured in a hyperbaric chamber, tubes feeding him sedatives while the suit systems ran their diagnostics. Actual sleep, vulnerable and dreamless, in a bunk that creaked with the ship's engines. He kept waking at odd hours, hand flying to a chest that no longer needed a life support unit, half convinced he'd hear the old mechanical wheeze and find nothing there but a young man's steady heartbeat. Each time, the absence startled him more than its presence ever had. Obi-Wan watched him during the day and said little, which was its own kind of interrogation. 20 years of memory told Anakin exactly how dangerous that silence was. Obi-Wan Kenobi did not miss things. He simply chose, with maddening discipline, when to name them. He named it on the second night, over field rations in the transport's cramped galley. You've been different since Presetlin, Obi-Wan said, not looking up from his meal. More different than a near-death experience usually makes a person. I got a good look at my own mortality, Anakin said. People change. People don't usually change into better tacticians overnight. That Eastern Ridge call, Anakin, that wasn't a hunch. That was a battle plan a council general would be proud of. Obi-Wan finally looked at him. Where did that come from? This was the danger of Obi-Wan, the same danger that had made him the one Jedi Vader could never fully outmaneuver even at the height of his power. He asked questions like a scalpel, small and precise, and he was patient enough to let the silence after them do the cutting. Anakin had spent decades learning to lie to Palpatine, to Imperial officers, to his own reflection in a black visor. Lying to Obi-Wan felt different. It felt like lying to himself, because some buried, still 19-year-old part of him had never stopped wanting this man's approval, never stopped flinching at his disappointment even after murdering him, or trying to, on a riverbank of fire that hadn't happened yet and, force willing, might never happen at all. I don't know, Anakin said, which was almost true. It felt like a memory, like I'd seen it before. Maybe the Force showed me something on Presetlin. A vision. Obi-Wan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. A vision of the future is a serious thing to withhold from the Council, Anakin. I'm not withholding it. I'm telling you I don't understand it yet. Another almost truth, the best kind of lie, the kind Vader had built an empire on. I'll bring it to Master Yoda when we're back at the temple. I just need time to make sense of what I saw. It bought him silence, if not trust. Obi-Wan returned to his ration bar, and Anakin returned to the harder work of not looking like a man carrying 20 years of atrocity behind a Padawan's face. The Jedi Temple, when they finally landed, hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't set foot in it since he burned it. Since he'd walked those same halls in black armor, with a squad of clone troopers at his back, and cut down anything that moved, younglings included, a memory that surfaced now, with a violence that nearly buckled his knees on the landing platform. Obi-Wan caught his elbow, steadying him, mistaking it for exhaustion from the journey. "You look pale," Obi-Wan said. "I'm fine," Anakin lied, staring up at spires he had once turned into a tomb, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Grief that hadn't yet been earned, for a crime that, in this strange looping thread of time, he had not yet committed and prayed to every god the galaxy had ever worshipped that he never would. Inside, younglings ran laughing through the corridors on their way to a training session, chasing a training remote that beeped indignantly as it dodged their outstretched hands. Anakin stopped walking. He knew, with a specific, nauseating clarity of a man who had done the thing, exactly what those children's faces would look like if he ever raised a blade against them. He had that memory. He would never not have that memory, whether or not this version of him ever earned it. "Anakin." Obi-Wan's voice, gentler now. "You've gone somewhere else again." "I'm fine," he said again, and made himself keep walking, made himself watch the younglings with something that might have looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like ordinary affection, and was in fact something closer to penance paid in advance. The council chamber summoned him the next morning. He had testified before council rooms before, in another life, in another shape, reports on separatist movements, requests for supplies, the occasional reprimand for recklessness that the war would eventually stop caring about. This was different. 12 masters in a circle of high-back chairs, the wraparound viewport behind them full of Coruscant's endless spires, and at the head, small and green and terrifyingly perceptive, Master Yoda. Different you feel," Yoda said, before Anakin had even finished his account of Presetlin. The old master's ears tilted forward, his jimmer stick-tapping once against the floor. "Older, heavier, a weight, I sense, that a Padawan should not carry." Anakin kept his voice level, kept his shoulders loose, kept every muscle in his young, unscarred face arranged into an expression of confused humility that he had rehearsed 100 times in a mirror as a much older, much crueler man performing loyalty for an emperor he despised. The skill transferred disturbingly well. "I had a vision, Master Yoda, on Presetlin. I think it showed me things that haven't happened yet. Things such as, here was the edge of the knife. Tell them everything, and he'd be locked in the temple's deepest archive for study, dissected by well-meaning masters, until whatever second chance he'd been given curdled into something worse than the fate he was trying to escape. Tell them nothing, and Yoda, who had sensed the Emperor's shadow across the galaxy for years without ever placing it, would keep circling closer to a truth Anakin wasn't ready to hand over. Fragments, Anakin said. War. Loss. Faces I didn't recognize, and some I did. I don't have the whole picture yet, Master. I need time. Mace Windu leaned forward, dark eyes unreadable. The Force does not typically grant visions without purpose, Skywalker, if you're withholding details. I'm not withholding on purpose, Anakin said, and let just enough genuine desperation bleed into his voice, because that part, at least, required no performance at all. I'm trying to understand what I saw before I say something that starts a panic I can't control. Silence settled over the chamber. Yoda's eyes, ancient and unblinking, held his for a long moment, long enough that Anakin felt, absurdly, like the old master was reading something written on the inside of his skull. Watch him we will, Yoda finally said, to the room rather than to Anakin directly, though the words landed the same either way. Trust, but also watch. A shadow moves in this one. Whether friend or warning, unclear it is. The council adjourned without further comment, and Anakin walked out of the chamber with his pulse hammering beneath a mask of perfect Jedi calm. A mask, he realized with grim humor, that he had first learned to wear in this very building, decades before a black helmet ever made the metaphor literal. He'd survived the first test. There would be others. And somewhere across the city, in an office in the Senate district, a man with kind eyes and a patient smile was waiting to greet an old friend who now knew, with total and terrible certainty, exactly what smiled back from behind that face. Master Yoda did not let it go. 3 days after the council hearing, Anakin found him in the room of 1,000 fountains, seated cross-legged on a moss-covered stone beside a waterfall's steady murmur, eyes closed as though meditating. Anakin knew better. Yoda had been waiting for him, not through any mundane scheduling, but through the kind of patient, current-reading awareness that made the old master more dangerous than any lightsaber duelist in the Order. Sit, Yoda said, without opening his eyes. Anakin sat. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Water rushed over stone. Somewhere above, birds native to a dozen worlds nested in transplanted trees, filling the vaulted chamber with the layered, indifferent business of small lives. Anakin let his own breathing settle into the rhythm of it, the way he'd learned to steady himself as a Padawan the first time. Decades and no time at all ago. Fear I sense in you, Yoda said finally. Old fear. Deep fear. Not the fear of a boy who nearly died on Presetlin. Fear worn smooth, like stone in a river. Fear carried along, long time. Anakin said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Anger, too, Yoda continued, and now his eyes opened, fixing on Anakin with an unblinking, ancient patience. Banked low like coals beneath ash. Controlled, remarkably controlled, for one so young. Trained anger, this is. Not a Padawan's anger. A warrior's. Master Yoda, I don't know what you want me to say. Say nothing. Only listen. Yoda's ears drooped slightly, and for a moment something that might have been sorrow crossed his ancient face. Long have I lived, Skywalker. Many futures glimpsed, in shadow and dream, none of them certain, all of them possible. Once, a vision came to me, dark, terrible, a galaxy in chains, a black shadow, astride it wearing a face I could not see clearly. He paused. Your face, some part of me, has always feared. Never spoken this aloud. Have I? Speak it now, I do, because different you have become, and wonder I must, has that shadow already fallen? Or does opportunity yet remain to stop it? Anakin's pulse roared in his ears. Every instinct honed across 20 years of court politics, of concealing his true face from an emperor who could read betrayal in a held breath, screamed at him to deflect, to lie smoothly, to redirect Yoda's suspicion anywhere but the truth. But this was Yoda, not Sidious, not an enemy to be managed, but the closest thing to a moral compass the Jedi Order had ever produced, and some starved, exhausted part of Anakin, the part that had spent 2 decades being right about everything and good at nothing, wanted badly to simply stop lying to somebody. If I told you that shadow already happened, Anakin said slowly, and that I'm what's left after it ended, would you believe me? Or would you have me arrested before I finished the sentence? Yoda was very still. Try me, you should. So Anakin told him, not everything. Not Padme, not the children he didn't yet know existed, not the details that would break something in him to say aloud in daylight. But enough. A war engineered from its first shot by a Sith Lord hiding inside the Republic's own government. An order destroyed from within by a command buried in every clone trooper's skull. A fall into darkness dressed up as strength and grief, and the desperate, catastrophic belief that power could prevent loss. A suit of black armor that had been less a punishment than a coffin he kept breathing in for over 20 years. When he finished, the fountains kept running, indifferent, and Yoda sat with his eyes closed for so long that Anakin began to wonder if the old master had simply refused to hear any of it. A terrible weight you have carried alone, Yoda said at last, very quietly. Alone, still you carry it, for tell the others, I will not, unless you wish it. your burden to bear. This is your choice how to bear it. You believe me? Feel truth in the Force. I do when spoken. Deceive an old Jedi, difficult, even for one who has learned deception well. A faint, sad smile touched Yoda's mouth. And feel your grief, I do. Real that grief is. Grief for things not yet done. This, the Force does not often permit. A gift, this is Skywalker. Rare. Perhaps unique. Waste it you must not. Relief hit Anakin so hard he had to look away, toward the waterfall, blinking against something that had no business showing on Vader's face, and every business showing on Anakin's. What do I do? He asked, and hated how young the question sounded. Do. Yoda's ears lifted slightly. The same as any being who wakes each morning not knowing the day's end. Choose. Again, and again, and again tomorrow and the day after. For a single choice, however great, does not undo a lifetime's pattern. A path, this is not a door. Walked one step at a time. The Chancellor, Anakin said. Palpatine. He's the one, Master. He's Sidious. I know it the way I know my own name. Something shifted in Yoda's expression, not surprise. Anakin realized with a chill, but confirmation. A suspicion long held, finally given shape. Sensed a darkness near him I have for years, Yoda admitted. Dismissed it, I did, as the ordinary corruption of politics. A mistake, that may have been. He tapped his jimmer stick once against a stone, thoughtful. Proof, we do not have. Only your word, and your word, precious as it is to me now, will not move Master Windu, or the Senate, or a galaxy comfortable in its ignorance. Then what good is knowing? Everything, Yoda said, and nothing, unless used wisely. Careful, you must be, Skywalker. A cornered serpent strikes fastest. Move against Sidious too soon, without proof, without allies, and destroy yourself you will, and confirm nothing to those who might have believed you eventually. His eyes narrowed slightly. And careful, too, you must be of yourself. The path you walked once remains within you, not erased by memory of its ending, only known. Known is not the same as conquered. Anakin thought of the training remote in the corridor, of younglings laughing, of a black glove closing around small necks in a memory that lived behind his eyes whether or not it had happened yet in this thread of time. I won't let it happen again. Hope this I do, with all that I am, Yoda said. But hope alone insufficient it is. Watch you I will. Help you I will where I am able. But walk this road, only you can, one choice, then the next. He closed his eyes again, folding his small hands in his lap. The audience apparently concluded. Go now. And Skywalker, the Chancellor's office, avoid it if you are able. Wounds not yet healed should not be tested before their time. Anakin rose, bowed with a formality he meant more sincerely than any bow he'd given in 20 years, and walked back out into the temple's bright corridors, carrying something he hadn't carried since long before Mustafar. The terrifying, fragile possibility of an ally. It would not last. 3 days later, a summons arrived from the Chancellor's office, requesting the personal presence of young Skywalker at his earliest convenience, an old friend. The message said, eager to reconnect after his brush with danger on Presetlin. The office hadn't changed. That was the first thing Anakin noticed, walking through the tall doors into Palpatine's private chambers high above the Senate district. The low light, the old artifacts arranged with careful, curated taste. The enormous viewport framing Coruscant's traffic like a painting. He had stood in this room 100 times across 2 different lives, and the sameness of it hit harder than he expected. A physical vertigo that had nothing to do with the turbolift ride up. Anakin. Palpatine rose from behind his desk, and the warmth in his voice was so perfectly calibrated, so exactly as Anakin remembered it, kind, avuncular, utterly without artifice on the surface, that for one disoriented moment Vader's hard-won hatred and Anakin's old, genuine fondness collided somewhere behind his ribs and left him unable to speak. Chancellor, he managed. Please. You know better. Palpatine crossed the room and clasped Anakin's forearm in both hands, the gesture warm, familiar, precisely the same gesture he'd used 1,000 times to make a lonely boy from Tatooine feel like the most important person in the galaxy. I heard about Presetlin. I confess I did not sleep well until word came that you were safe. You gave this old man a fright. You gave the order that put me on that battlefield, Anakin thought, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after years of not being permitted to think it. You've been giving those orders since before I was born into this war. I'm fine, Anakin said aloud, a little rattled. Nothing more. Sit, sit. Palpatine gestured him toward the familiar chairs by the viewport and poured 2 cups of tea with his own hands. Another old ritual, another small intimacy designed. Anakin now understood with the benefit of 20 ruined years. To make a Jedi forget he was speaking to the most dangerous being in the galaxy. Tell me everything. I want to hear it from you, not some sanitized council report. This was the test, and Anakin had known it was coming since the summons arrived. Palpatine was not merely fond of him, never had been merely fond of him. Every kindness, every confidence shared, every careful cultivation of resentment against the Jedi's rules had been reconnaissance. A slow siege against a mind Palpatine intended eventually to own outright. The Sith Lord across from him was, in this moment, doing precisely what he had always done. Watching, patient and thorough, for any crack in the boy's composure that might be worked wider later. Anakin had spent 2 decades learning to give Sidious exactly what he wanted to see and nothing more. It was, perversely, the one skill from his old life that translated here without modification. There isn't much to tell, Anakin said, sipping the tea, letting a careful, boyish frustration color his voice. We held the line. I got lucky reading the droid movements. Obi-Wan thinks I had some kind of vision. Did you? Palpatine's eyes were bright, curious, entirely too interested for a simple political inquiry. Maybe. It's hard to explain. Anakin looked down into his cup, playing at embarrassment. Master Yoda thinks it means something. I think it just means I got scared enough to think faster than usual. Palpatine laughed, an easy, delighted sound. The same laugh Anakin remembered offering him wine and sympathy on 100 evenings when the Jedi Council's restrictions had chafed hardest. The Jedi have never appreciated instinct the way they should. All that talk of trusting the Force. And yet the moment a young man's instincts actually serve him, they treat it as a puzzle to be solved rather than a gift to be trusted. He shook his head, an old performance of gentle exasperation. You've always had more raw talent than the whole council combined, Anakin. It concerns me, sometimes, how little credit they give you for it. There it is, the old wound pressing, the careful cultivation of grievance, laid down brick by brick over years until it built a wall between Anakin and everyone who might have saved him. Anakin recognized the technique now with the cold appreciation of a man watching a master craftsman work, because he was watching a master craftsman work, the same one who had built him, piece by piece, into a monster. They do what they think is right, Anakin said carefully, testing the ground. Even when I don't agree with it. Something flickered behind Palpatine's eyes, surprise, quickly masked. Anakin had deviated from a script the old man had run 100 times in his head, and Sidious, whatever else he was, did not enjoy surprises. That's uncommonly generous of you, Palpatine said, his tone light, but his gaze suddenly sharper. You've seemed different since Presetlin, more measured. Master Kenobi mentioned as much to the Senate liaison, actually in passing. A pause, deliberate, testing. Should I be concerned that my young friend has grown too wise for me to keep up with? Anakin met his eyes and let himself feel, for just a moment, the full and terrible weight of what he knew. That this kind, wounded old man's face was a mask over something that had orchestrated a galaxy's suffering for its own gain, that had used Anakin's love for Padme as a leash, had turned his fear of loss into a chain, had ultimately cost him everything a human being could lose, and called it destiny. He let none of it show. I almost died, Anakin said instead, quietly. And this at least required no performance at all. It changes how you see things. That's all it is. Palpatine studied him for a long moment, the particular, unhurried study of a predator recalibrating its approach to prey that has, unexpectedly, stopped moving the way prey is supposed to move. Then the warmth returned to his face, seamless, as though it had never left. Of course, he said. Of course it does. You'll forgive an old man his worry. I think of you as something like family, Anakin, and family makes fools of us all. He refilled Anakin's tea, unbidden. You'll come to me, won't you? if the Jedi's restrictions ever weigh too heavily. My door is always open. Some perspectives, I find, are only available outside the temple's walls. I'll remember that, Chancellor. He left 20 minutes later with the taste of tea still on his tongue and the unshakable, bone-deep certainty that he had just spent half an hour lying to the most dangerous mind in the galaxy, and for now, gotten away with it. Behind him, in the office's dim light, Chief Palpatine remained seated at his desk for a long while after the doors closed, tenting his fingers beneath his chin, his expression, for the first time in a very long game, genuinely, quietly troubled. Something about the boy had changed. Sidious did not yet know what, but 2,000 years of Sith patience had taught him one enduring lesson. Uncertainty was a splinter that, left unaddressed, festered into disaster. He would watch young Skywalker more closely now. He would watch and wait, and if necessary, he would remind the boy precisely why the dark side had always, eventually, claimed everyone who came within its reach. The mission to Umbara's outer moon should have been a footnote in the war, a supply convoy interdiction, minor separatist presence, the kind of assignment the Council handed to Padawans to build their combat record without excessive risk. Anakin knew better the moment he read the briefing. He remembered this operation. Not perfectly. 20 years and a suit's worth of trauma had blurred plenty of details, but the shape of it surfaced with the sick clarity of a scar being pressed. A separatist ambush disguised as a weak convoy, meant to lure Republic forces into a crossfire from droid emplacements hidden in the moon's ice caves. In the history he remembered, it had worked. An entire company of clones had been lost, along with the Jedi commander leading them, a young knight named Ferrus Olin, whose name Anakin hadn't thought about in decades and whose death he now recalled with fresh horror he had once read about in a casualty report with the same numb detachment he gave every other statistic of that war. Something wrong? Obi-Wan asked, watching him study the tactical display in the briefing room aboard their cruiser. The convoy's a trap, Anakin said. It's too light. 3 cargo haulers with a single gunship escort, moving through contested space without requesting reinforcement? No separatist quartermaster is that careless. They want us to see an easy target. Captain Rex, arms crossed near the display table, raised an eyebrow, new to Anakin's command in this thread of time, though the two of them had fought together for years in the life Anakin remembered, and the ache of not being recognized by a man who would one day become one of his closest allies was its own small, private grief. You got intel we don't, sir? Instinct, Anakin said, the same word he'd been leaning on for weeks now, worn thin from overuse, but still the only shield he had, and a bad feeling about ice caves that just happened to run under the landing zone. Obi-Wan studied the display a moment longer, then nodded slowly. If you're right, an ambush from below during the boarding action would be catastrophic. Rex, what if we adjusted the approach, took the gunships in low over the northern ridge instead of a direct descent? We'd lose the element of surprise on the convoy, Rex said, but we'd deny them the kill box. He glanced at Anakin. Your call, General. Sir. A small stumble. Anakin wasn't a general yet in this timeline, wouldn't be for some time, and Rex caught himself with the faint embarrassment of a man who'd apparently already started thinking of him as one. They took the northern ridge. It cost them 2 hours, and the convoy interdiction went less cleanly than the mission parameters wanted. 3 of the cargo haulers escaping into hyperspace before the Republic gunships could pin them down. But when the ice caves lit up with hidden droid emplacements 20 minutes later, they lit up against a boarding force that wasn't there. Empty landing zones, wasted ordnance, a trap sprung on nothing. Ferrus Olin's company held the ridge instead, and when the Separatist ambush force finally broke cover to investigate their failure, Anakin was waiting with a plan built on 20 years of hindsight and a Padawan's willingness to gamble everything on instinct nobody could verify. The battle that followed was, by any objective measure, a rout. Anakin fought with a controlled ferocity that startled everyone around him. Precise, economical, utterly without the reckless flourish that had defined Anakin Skywalker's dueling style in every account Obi-Wan had ever heard of him. This was not a gifted Padawan showing off. This was a veteran conserving energy for a fight he intended to survive by any means necessary, and it showed in every efficient parry, every strike that ended an engagement in half the movements it should have taken. Afterward, standing amid disabled droids and clone troopers cheering their unlikely near-bloodless victory, Ferrus Olin approached him with an expression somewhere between gratitude and unease. "You saved my whole company, Skywalker," Olin said. "I don't know how you called that ambush, but I owe you more than I can say." "Don't owe me anything," Anakin said. "Just get your men home." Olin nodded, still watching him with that same faint wariness Anakin had started to recognize as the natural response of anyone who spent real time around him now. A sense, inarticulate but persistent, that something about this Padawan didn't add up. It was the same look Obi-Wan gave him more and more often. The same look Yoda's silence carried. Rex fell into step beside him as they walked back toward the extraction point, helmet under one arm, expression thoughtful in the way of a man doing math he wasn't sure he liked the answer to. "Ferrus is right," Rex said. "That wasn't luck back there. I've served with a lot of Jedi, sir, a lot of good ones. Never seen a Padawan fight like that. Never seen anybody call a battle that clean, that far ahead." "Is that a problem, Captain?" "No, sir." Rex considered his words with the careful precision Anakin remembered from 100 battles fought in another life, back when this same man had called him general with genuine loyalty, right up until a chip in his brain had turned that loyalty into a blaster bolt at close range. The memory sat in Anakin's chest like a stone. "Just an observation. Whatever you are, sir, I've got a feeling my brothers are luckier for it." They didn't know yet how true or how fragile that luck really was. Anakin had saved company today by cheating with knowledge no living person should possess, but he could feel already how thin that advantage would wear as the war ground on. How many battles remained where his fractured, imperfect memory of a future that might no longer even be certain simply wouldn't be enough. He wasn't omniscient. He was a man carrying half a war's worth of hindsight and none of a certainty that hindsight implied, because every choice he made now rippled forward into a future that was, for the first time in his existence, genuinely unwritten. That uncertainty terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. Vader had operated for 20 years within a story whose ending he already knew, horrific as it was. Anakin now operated within no story at all, only fragments, echoes, a general shape of catastrophe he was trying to bend without knowing exactly which small kindness might avert it or which reckless gamble might cause it all over again. Faster, worse sooner. As their gunship lifted off Umbara's frozen moon, Rex settled into the seat across from him, still watching him with that same careful, calculating respect. "For what it's worth, sir," Rex said, "whatever's going on with you, the men are starting to talk. Good talk. The kind that gets you a reputation early in a war like this one." He paused. Reputations cut both ways, though. Might want to think about who's listening. Anakin thought of Palpatine's office, of tea poured with careful hands, of a predator's patient recalibration behind kind eyes. Rex had no way of knowing how precisely he'd struck the nerve. "I know," Anakin said quietly, watching the ice moon shrink behind them into the dark. "Believe me, Captain, I know exactly who's listening." The mission to Concordia was never supposed to involve him. Anakin learned this 3 days after Umbara, summoned to a briefing where Obi-Wan explained, with obvious reluctance, that Republic intelligence had traced a separatist weapons pipeline through Mandalorian space, funneled, they suspected, through Death Watch, the radical splinter faction that rejected the new Mandalorians' pacifism in favor of a return to the old warrior ways. The operation called for stealth, minimal Republic footprint, and, over Obi-Wan's stated objections, a Padawan whose unusual instincts had already proven valuable twice in the field. "I don't like it," Obi-Wan told the council, standing before the holographic circle of masters with Anakin at his side. "Death Watch operates by a code the Republic doesn't understand, and the Jedi have no standing with. This isn't a battlefield with clear lines. It's a knife fight in the dark." "Agree I do that caution is warranted," Yoda said, his eyes flicking briefly, meaningfully, toward Anakin. "But value in Skywalker's instincts we have already seen. Trust them in this matter also, I am inclined to." Mace Windu's projection studied Anakin with characteristic bluntness. "Mandalorian politics are not Jedi politics, Skywalker. Death Watch will not respond to lightsaber diplomacy. If you go to observe and report, not to start a war the Republic isn't prepared to fight. Anakin nodded, already knowing, with the particular, hollow certainty of a man remembering a history the others in this room hadn't lived yet, exactly how badly this exact philosophy had failed the Jedi in the timeline he came from. Restraint, patience, procedural caution, all admirable, all correct in the abstract, and all catastrophically insufficient against enemies who exploited the Order's hesitation as a weapon in itself. He'd watched that pattern play out for 2 decades from the other side of it. He said none of this to the Council. He'd learned, in the weeks since waking in his own younger body, exactly how much unsolicited philosophy from a Padawan bought him. Suspicion, mostly, and Yoda's quiet, patient concern. Understood, Master Windu, he said instead. Concordia Surface was a study in old grievance. Rust Belt industrial cities built atop a moon Death Watch had claimed as their own defiant answer to New Mandalore's softer capital. Every wall scarred with the sigils of clans who measured honor in Beskar and blood rather than treaties. Anakin infiltrated alongside 2 clone commandos, disguised as independent arms brokers looking to make contact with the weapons pipeline's local handlers, a cover story that put them, within 6 hours of landing, directly into a warehouse meeting with 3 Death Watch lieutenants and a nervous separatist logistics officer trying to look more important than he was. The meeting went sideways almost immediately. One of the commando's comm implants pinged wrong against a Mandalorian scanner sweep, and within seconds blasters were drawn on both sides of the negotiating table. The warehouse's cavernous dark, suddenly full of shouting, and the particular metallic ring of Beskar-plated warriors readying for violence. Anakin's hands rose empty before either commando could fire. "Wait," he said, sharp enough to cut through the noise, and something in his tone, the flat, absolute command of a man who had once ordered Star Destroyers into battle with a word, made even the Death Watch lieutenants hesitate, weapons still raised but not yet firing. "You don't want a firefight in a warehouse full of your own ordnance. Neither do I. Let's talk like people who both want to walk away from this." The senior lieutenant, a broad-shouldered woman with a cracked helmet visor and the bearing of someone who'd buried more allies than she cared to count, studied him with open suspicion. "Jedi don't broker weapons deals. What are you really doing here, boy?" "I'm doing exactly what you think I'm doing," Anakin said, discarding the cover story with the same instinct that had told him on Umbara, exactly when a careful lie stopped serving him better than a careful truth. "The Republic wants to know who's arming Death Watch and why. I'm not here to stop your war with New Mandalore. That's not my fight, and frankly, I don't think it's the Republic's business either." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. Beside her, the separatist officer looked increasingly alarmed at a conversation drifting somewhere far outside his authorization. "Then why are you here?" "Because the people arming you aren't doing it out of charity." Anakin nodded toward the separatist officer, who flinched. "Count Dooku doesn't care who wins your civil war. He cares that a fractured, bleeding Mandalore is a Mandalore too busy to ever threaten the Confederacy's flank. You're not being armed as allies. You're being armed as a knife the separatists intend to keep pointed at your own people's throats indefinitely, useful exactly as long as you keep bleeding, and not 1 day longer." It was, Anakin knew, precisely the kind of unprovable, inflammatory claim Mace Windu had explicitly warned him against making. It was also based on 20 years of hindsight regarding exactly how Dooku and Sidious treated every faction they touched as disposable leverage, almost certainly true, and more importantly, it was a truth this particular audience was primed to believe about outsiders offering them power. The lieutenant's gaze slid toward the separatist officer with new and considerable menace. "Is that true?" My orders are simply to facilitate the transaction," the officer stammered, which was, in the language of frightened bureaucrats everywhere, as good as a confession. What followed was not the clean diplomatic victory a Jedi report might have hoped for. Death Watch did not become the Republic's ally that day, did not abandon their war against New Mandalore, did not suddenly embrace the peace their splinter faction existed specifically to reject. But the weapons pipeline broke. The lieutenant, with a particular cold fury of a warrior realizing she'd been played, Had her men seized the Separatist shipment for themselves rather than complete the exchange? A theft that would sour Death Watch's relationship with the Confederacy for months to come and cost the Separatists a foothold in Mandalorian space they wouldn't easily rebuild. It was not a victory that would appear in any Jedi Temple record as a triumph of the light. It was, Anakin understood clearly, a cynical, morally murky outcome achieved by manipulating one faction's paranoia against another, a very Vader solution wearing a very Anakin face, and the discomfort of that overlap followed him back to the extraction point like a shadow he couldn't outrun. You lied to a room full of armed Mandalorians and somehow talked your way into starting a fight that wasn't yours to start, the senior commando said afterward, on the shuttle back to the cruiser, something between admiration and unease in his voice. Remind me never to play Sabacc against you, sir. Anakin looked out at Concordia's rust-colored surface, falling away beneath them, and thought of Mace Windu's warning, lightsaber diplomacy, and the fact that he hadn't ignited his blade once during the entire operation, had instead won by exploiting fear and paranoia with the same cold precision he'd once used to conquer star systems for an empire he despised. The tools hadn't changed. Only, this time, the outcome had actually helped someone other than himself. He wasn't sure yet whether that distinction was enough to matter, or whether he was simply becoming very good at telling himself it was. The council assigned Ahsoka Tano to him on a morning that felt, to everyone else in the temple, like an unremarkable administrative matter. A 14-year-old Togruta initiate deemed ready for Padawan training, paired with a promising young Jedi whose battlefield instincts had begun to draw quiet, careful attention from the masters who track such things. To Anakin, standing in the antechamber outside the council doors, reading the assignment notice on a data pad with hands that had gone suddenly uselessly cold, it felt like the floor of the galaxy tilting under him. He had not expected this. He had known in the abstract, distant way a man knows the shape of a scar he can no longer feel, that Ahsoka existed somewhere in this timeline's future, a memory of orange skin and blue-striped montrals, of a bond that had meant more to him than he'd ever properly admitted even to himself, of an ending on Mustafar's black sands where he'd let himself forget her rather than face what he'd become in her absence. He had not expected the council to hand her to him now, months earlier than she'd entered his life the first time, a child who in his memory had grown into someone fierce and clever and loyal enough to walk away from the Jedi Order rather than accept an injustice, and who, in this thread of time, hadn't done any of it yet, hadn't done anything yet, was, right now, simply a nervous 14-year-old waiting outside a training sal to meet a master she knew almost nothing about. Anakin stood outside that same sal for 11 minutes before he made himself go in, and every one of those minutes was spent fighting down a rising, useless panic that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with love, the specific, terrifying love of a father who has already buried a version of this child once, metaphorically if not literally, and cannot bear the thought of failing her twice. She was exactly, as he remembered, and entirely a stranger. Younger than the Ahsoka who lived in his memory, sharper-edged in her uncertainty, her chin lifted in a defiance that hadn't yet been tempered by 3 years of war and hard-won competence. She bowed formally when he entered, montrals held with careful dignity, and introduced herself with the rehearsed correctness of an initiate determined not to embarrass herself in front of a master she'd clearly heard rumors about. Master Skywalker, I'm Ahsoka Tano. I look forward to training under you. Anakin's throat closed around a dozen things he could never say. I know you. I've watched you grow into someone extraordinary. I've grieved you. I failed you. I am so sorry for a future you haven't lived, and I intend to make sure you never do, and settled, instead, on the only honest thing available to him. Likewise, Snips. The nickname escaped before he could stop it, a private, affectionate diminishment born from years of battlefield camaraderie that hadn't happened yet, that this girl had no context for and no reason to expect from a master she'd met 30 seconds ago. Ahsoka blinked, startled, a flush of something between offense and confusion crossing her face. Excuse me. Sorry. Anakin recovered, forced something like a normal introduction into his voice. Bad habit. I meant, it's good to meet you, Ahsoka. I think we're going to work well together. She studied him with open, assessing curiosity. The same sharp intelligence he remembered, present even here, even this young, even before 3 years of war had sanded it into the formidable instrument it would become. He said that like you already know it's true. Force, she's exactly the same. Call it optimism, Anakin said. Let's get started. I want to see what you can do. What followed, over the subsequent weeks, was a training relationship unlike anything Ahsoka had likely expected and unlike anything Anakin had ever consciously planned to give her. He remembered, with a specific ache of hindsight, every mistake he'd made as her master the first time, the impatience, the reckless example he'd set that she'd absorbed and mirrored, the ways his own unresolved rage had leaked into her training, as a lesson she never should have learned. This time he found himself teaching differently, more carefully, catching himself mid-sentence, when old habits of harsh, dismissive correction rose up unbidden and replacing them, deliberately, with the patience he wished someone had shown him at that age. It was not always successful. There were days the old Anakin, the reckless one, the one who solved problems by force of will and raw talent rather than discipline, surfaced despite his best efforts, and he watched Ahsoka absorb those moments too, filing them away the way sharp children always do, testing which version of her master was the real one. You're weird, she told him bluntly, 3 weeks into training, after he'd stopped her mid-exercise to correct a stance with more gentleness than the mistake seemed to warrant. Master Pielo Kun said you're supposed to be some kind of prodigy, reckless, impatient. The other initiates talk about it. She tilted her head, Montrals catching the practice hall's light. You don't seem reckless. You seem like you're trying really hard not to be something. Anakin felt that observation land somewhere it had no business landing, delivered with all the unguarded honesty of a 14-year-old who hadn't yet learned to soften truths for the comfort of adults. Maybe I am, he admitted, which surprised them both. Why? There was no honest answer he could give her, not yet, maybe not ever. Because the person I used to be made a lot of mistakes, he said instead, choosing each word with the care of a man defusing something live. And I'd like to be someone different for you. That's all. Ahsoka considered this with the particular seriousness of a child deciding whether an adult's strange behavior deserved trust or suspicion, and something in her expression, intelligent, watchful, already so recognizably her, settled, provisionally, on trust. Okay, she said. Weird. But okay. Their bond grew faster than Anakin expected. Faster perhaps than was strictly wise, given how carefully he was supposed to be managing every relationship in this fragile, unwritten timeline. He caught himself, more than once, treating her with an ease and affection that belonged to 3 years of shared battles she hadn't fought yet, catching Obi-Wan's curious glances at moments of familiarity that made no sense for a master and Padawan barely a month into their partnership. It came to a head on a training mission to Kiros, a minor skirmish against pirate raiders that should have been simple and turned, with the galaxy's usual indifference to simplicity, into something far more dangerous when the raiders revealed heavier weaponry than intelligence had indicated. Ahsoka, cornered in a collapsing supply depot with 2 raiders closing from opposite sides, did something Anakin remembered vividly from a battle 3 years further along in the timeline he'd lived the first time, a reckless, clever redirection of a support strut that brought half the ceiling down on both attackers at once. A maneuver he'd seen her execute a dozen times as a seasoned Padawan and had never, in this current reality, actually taught her. She emerged from the dust coughing, triumphant, and more than a little surprised at her own success. Did you see that? I don't even know where that idea came from. Anakin stared at her, ice running through him despite the depot's heat. Asterisk, you did that in a battle you haven't fought yet. You did it years early, in a body that hasn't grown into that instinct on its own. Asterisk, the unsettling possibility surfaced, cold and immediate, that some resonance of the timeline he remembered was bleeding through, that his own foreknowledge was somehow shaping the galaxy around him in ways beyond his direct choices. Or more disturbing still, that some echo of the Ahsoka he'd known was reaching backward through the Force itself, the way his own consciousness once had, to find her earlier self. He didn't know which possibility frightened him more. He said neither aloud. Good instincts, he told her instead, voice carefully level. You should trust them more. I do trust them, Ahsoka said, wiping dust from her montrals with cheerful, adolescent confidence. I just wasn't sure you would. I trust you more than you will ever know, Anakin thought, watching her survey the collapsed depot with visible pride. Already so much the fierce, capable Jedi he remembered and had failed and desperately, quietly intended never to fail again. I trust you, he said aloud. That's not going to change. It was, he realized as they walked back toward extraction together, the truest thing he had said to anyone since waking on that ridge months ago. And also, given everything he knew about the disaster this galaxy was hurtling toward, possibly the most dangerous promise he had ever made. The Separatist offensive on JBM broke every expectation the Republic's war planners had built their strategy around. Anakin remembered the campaign only in fragments, a costly, demoralizing engagement fought in perpetual rain and mud, one of the war's uglier chapters, the kind of battle that ground on for weeks and produced no clean victories, only attrition. He hadn't remembered the details clearly enough to prevent it, hadn't been able to offer Obi-Wan or the Council any useful foreknowledge beyond a vague, unsettled dread that had made him argue, unsuccessfully, against committing forces to the planet at all. The Council had committed anyway. Strategic necessity, they'd called it. JBM's mineral wealth and position along a critical hyperspace corridor made it worth the risk. 3 weeks into the campaign, dug into a flooded trench line with Ahsoka at his side, and Rex's men strung thin along a perimeter that kept collapsing faster than it could be reinforced. Anakin understood exactly why this battle lived in his memory as something worse than ordinary war. The Separatists had brought a new kind of droid to JBM, modified IG Lancers with adaptive combat programming that learned and countered Republic tactics in real time, a technological escalation that Anakin's foreknowledge, built on a war he remembered fighting differently, couldn't fully anticipate. Twice already his hindsight had failed him outright. Battle plans built on a future that no longer matched the one unfolding, costing lives his advantage was supposed to save. It was the third failure that broke something loose in him. A flanking maneuver he remembered succeeding, clean, decisive, the kind of tactical certainty he'd leaned on for months, now like a crutch. Instead walked directly into a droid ambush the adaptive programming had anticipated and countered before Anakin's unit even reached the ridge. 6 clone troopers died in the first 90 seconds. Anakin watched it happen through comm static and Ahsoka's panic voice calling coordinates that arrived 4 seconds too late to matter. Watched men he'd fought beside for months, men whose names he knew, whose faces he'd have carried the rest of his life in the timeline he remembered, cut down by a mistake built on his own overconfidence in a memory that had simply, quietly, stopped being reliable. Something in him went very cold and very quiet. He didn't remember deciding to charge the ridge alone. He remembered afterward fragments, the wet slap of mud under his boots, the ignition hum of his lightsaber cutting a swath through droid fire that should have killed him a dozen times over, the specific, silencing focus that descended over him in the moment he stopped calculating risk and simply completely gave himself over to raw and furious lethality. He remembered cutting down the ambush position in a span of minutes that felt, from inside it, both instantaneous and endless. Remembered a wet metal smell of scorched droid plating in rain. Remembered the particular, terrible clarity that came from letting 20 years of Vader's controlled, weaponized rage answer a grief Anakin's young heart hadn't learned to carry safely yet. By the time he stopped, the ridge was clear, the ambush position obliterated, and he was standing in a crater of his own, making with his breath coming in ragged gasps, and something dark and satisfied coiled low in his chest, a feeling he recognized instantly, viscerally, with the horror of a man realizing he has just embraced an old and familiar poison without noticing the first swallow. Anakin. Ahsoka's voice, small and uncertain behind him. He turned, and the look on her face, not fear exactly, but a wary, searching confusion, the look of a Padawan encountering something in her master she had no framework to understand, hit him harder than any blaster bolt JBM's mud had thrown at him all campaign. "You went dark," she said quietly. "Just for a second. I felt it." It was like she struggled for the word. Young enough that the vocabulary of the thing hadn't fully formed for her yet, old enough in this compressed, accelerated version of her training that she already recognized its shape. It was like something else was standing where you were. Anakin looked down at his hands, still shaking with adrenaline and something worse, and thought of a black glove closing around a Jedi's throat on a chamber floor that didn't exist yet in this timeline and might, if he wasn't careful, exist again regardless. I lost 6 men today because I trusted a memory that stopped being true, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I got angry. I let it out. That's all that happened. That's not all that happened. Ahsoka's chin lifted. That same stubborn defiance he remembered and loved and had, in this fragile new timeline, sworn to protect from every hard lesson that had once shaped it into something harder than it needed to be. I felt you angry before. This was different. This felt old. Like it wasn't the first time. Because it wasn't. Because the rage that had carried him through that ridge wasn't a Padawan's untrained fury, but a Sith Lord's practiced, weaponized grief. 20 years in the making, still living in him whether or not the suit that had once housed it existed anymore. Yoda's warning surfaced in his memory with fresh and unwelcome clarity. Known is not the same as conquered. He had believed, these past months, that awareness of his own darkness was sufficient armor against it. Jabium's mud and blood said otherwise. That night, in the flooded remains of their forward camp, Obi-Wan found him sitting apart from the others, staring at nothing, still faintly shaking with the aftermath of whatever had moved through him on the ridge. Rex told me what happened, Obi-Wan said, settling beside him without invitation. He said it was the kind of fighting that wins battles and loses something else in the process. His words, not mine, though I confess I understand the sentiment. I lost control, Anakin said flatly. You lost 6 men and grieved for them in the only language your training has given you so far. Obi-Wan's voice was gentler than Anakin expected, carrying none of the wary suspicion that had colored so many of their conversations these past months. That's not the same thing as losing control, Anakin, though I understand why it might feel that way. You don't understand, Anakin said, and the words came out sharper than he meant, edged with an old exhaustion that had nothing to do with this particular night. You don't know what that feeling is, what it becomes if I let it. Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment, watching him with a particular, patient attention that Anakin remembered as one of the few genuinely trustworthy constants of either life he'd lived. Master Yoda tells me you've shared something with him, something you haven't shared with me, or the rest of the council. A pause, careful, not accusing. I won't pretend that doesn't sting a little, but I trust his judgment, and by extension, I'm choosing to trust that whatever burden you're carrying is one you have good reason to carry alone for now. Anakin said nothing. The rain had thinned to a persistent drizzle, and somewhere across the camp a wounded trooper's pain was audible even through a medic tent's canvas walls, a sound that seemed, in that moment, to carry the whole war's accumulated weight. Whatever it is, Obi-Wan continued quietly, I want you to understand something the Council sometimes forgets to say plainly enough. Fear of falling is not the same as falling, Anakin. A Jedi who never feels the pull of the dark side isn't strong. He's simply never been tested. The test isn't whether you feel it. It's what you do in the moment after you do. And if what I do isn't good enough, then you try again the next time, Obi-Wan said, echoing Yoda's words from months ago, so closely that Anakin felt something in his chest tighten. That's all any of us can do. That's all being a Jedi has ever actually required, not perfection, whatever the code's language might suggest. Just the willingness to keep choosing, even after you've chosen wrong. Anakin thought of Ahsoka's wary eyes on the ridge, of 6 names he'd have to write into a report tonight, of the dark satisfaction that had coiled in his chest in the instant before he recognized it for what it was. He thought, too, of a black suit and a throne room and a version of himself that had stopped trying to choose differently a long, long time before any of this began. I keep thinking I've already lost this fight, he admitted, quieter than he meant to. That I'm just delaying an ending I already know. Then delay it, Obi-Wan said simply. Delay it every day, for as many days as you're given. Some victories aren't dramatic, Anakin. Some of them just look like getting up tomorrow and choosing, again, not to become the thing you're afraid of. He rose, offering Anakin a hand up out of the mud with the same steady, unshakable loyalty that had once, would once, might still, mean nothing at all against a betrayal on a volcanic riverbank. Get some rest. JBM isn't finished with us yet, and neither, I suspect, are you. Anakin took his hand, and for the first time since waking in his own younger body, allowed himself to consider, carefully, without full conviction, but without immediately rejecting it either, the possibility that Obi-Wan Kenobi might deserve to be trusted with more of the truth than Anakin had so far allowed him. That possibility would not survive the week. But for one rain-soaked night on a battlefield that had already taken more than it should have, it was, however fragile, however temporary, something close to hope. The truth did not survive the week, but not for the reasons Anakin feared. It survived for exactly 4 more days before Palpatine forced the issue himself. The summons came disguised as celebration. Word had reached the Senate of the JBM campaign's costly but decisive turn. Republic forces finally breaking the Separatist adaptive droid advantage through a combination of Ahsoka's battlefield ingenuity, Rex's men's hard-won attrition, and a tactical brilliance from young Skywalker that the official reports, sanitized of the Ridge's true cost, were already calling remarkable. The Chancellor wished to congratulate the hero of JBM personally. Attendance was, in the particular way of Palpatine's invitations, not optional. Anakin went alone this time, against Obi-Wan's mild but persistent objection, and walked into the familiar office with a wariness he no longer bothered to fully disguise. Something had shifted in Palpatine's manner since their last meeting, the warmth still present, still practiced, but underlaid now with something sharper, more probing, a predator who had spent months circling a piece of prey that refused to behave the way prey should. Anakin. Palpatine rose from behind his desk, and this time there was no tea, no ritual of intimacy. Only a long, assessing look that made the temperature of the room feel several degrees colder. The hero of JBM. The Senate can't stop talking about you. I'm not sure hero is the word I'd choose. No, Palpatine agreed, watching him with unsettling precision. I don't imagine it is. 6 men lost on that ridge, I understand. A costly correction to a battle that should never have required correcting, if the tactical reports I've read are accurate. He circled the desk slowly, unhurried, every movement deliberate. You've been unusually accurate these past months, Anakin. Unusually prescient. For a Padawan barely into the 2nd year of his apprenticeship. I find myself wondering where such prescience comes from. Instinct, Anakin said, the same worn shield he'd used for months now, though even as he said it he felt how thin it had become. Instinct. Palpatine's smile did not reach his eyes. You know, I've lived a very long time, Anakin, longer, in certain respects, than my public record would suggest. I have studied the Force in ways the Jedi Order would find deeply uncomfortable, in traditions far older and far less sanitized than the code they've raised you on. I know what genuine prescience looks like. I know what a true vision feels like, moving through a mind unprepared for it. He stopped, very close now, his pale eyes fixed on Anakin's face with an intensity that stripped away every pretense of casual conversation. And I know, with total certainty, that what I am looking at right now is not instinct. It is memory. The room went very still. Somewhere beyond the viewport, Coruscant's endless traffic continued its indifferent flow, oblivious to the moment quietly detonating inside this office. I don't know what you mean, Anakin said, and even to his own ears the lie sounded thin, exhausted, a shield finally worn through after months of relentless use. Don't you? Palpatine's voice had lost its warmth entirely now, replaced by something colder and infinitely more familiar. The voice Anakin remembered from a throne room, from a Death Star's command deck, from 20 years of orders given in the flat, absolute cadence of a man who had never once doubted his own right to rule. You move like a soldier twice your age. You fight like someone who has already buried the mistakes of his own inexperience and simply chosen not to repeat them. You look at me, Anakin, and I have watched you do this for months now, growing more confident each time, as though you already know exactly what I am. He tilted his head, something almost curious beneath the menace. So, tell me, what am I? There was no version of this conversation that ended safely. Anakin understood that with total cold clarity, understood that whatever answer he gave, honest or evasive, Sidious had already decided the shape of what came next. had likely decided at the moment suspicion first calcified into certainty weeks or months ago. The only remaining choice was what kind of confrontation this became. "You're Darth Sidious," Anakin said, and felt something enormous settle into place as the words finally, after months of careful containment, left his mouth. "You've been the Sith Master orchestrating this entire war since before it started. Dooku is your apprentice. The Separatists and the Republic are both your armies, bleeding each other for your benefit. And when the war ends, you intend to end the Republic itself and rule what's left as Emperor." Silence. Palpatine's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it shifted, recalibrated. The mask of the kindly Chancellor dissolving by careful degrees into something older and infinitely more dangerous. "Remarkable," he said softly. "Every detail correct. I confess, Anakin, I did not expect this conversation to arrive quite so directly." He studied Anakin with an intensity that felt almost admiring, almost fond, in the specific, possessive way a collector admires a rare and dangerous specimen. "The question, then, is not what you know. The question is how you came to know it, and what, precisely, you intend to do with the knowledge." "I intend to stop you. Do you?" Palpatine's smile returned, thin and knowing. "With what army, Anakin?" "The Jedi Council, who have spent months growing more suspicious of your own unexplained gifts than of anything I've done. A Republic Senate that trusts me more than it has ever trusted the Jedi Order. You have knowledge, yes, remarkable, impossible knowledge, the origin of which I intend to understand fully before this conversation ends. But knowledge without power is simply a burden, and you are, whatever else you may be, still a boy standing alone in my office." The force around them thickened, pressure building in the air like the moment before a lightning strike, and Anakin recognized it instantly. The specific, familiar gathering of dark side intent he had felt from the other side 1,000 times, had wielded himself for 20 years, had never once expected to face as prey rather than predator. "You've come from somewhere," Sidious said, circling closer, his voice dropping into something almost hypnotic. The old, seductive cadence Anakin remembered from 100 private conversations designed to reshape a lonely boy's fears into usable weapons. "Somewhere you already lived a life I have not yet lived myself. I can feel the shape of it around you, Anakin, a wound that hasn't happened yet, and somehow already has. Tell me, did you serve me in that other life? Did I finally make you what I always intended you to become?" Anakin's hand went to his belt, fingers finding his lightsaber's hilt, though he made no move yet to ignite it. "I became something I'm never going to become again." "Fascinating," Sidious murmured, and there was genuine, hungry interest in his voice now, the tone of a scholar encountering a specimen more valuable than anything he'd hoped to find. "A second chance, granted by forces even I do not fully understand. Do you have any conception, boy, of how precious that is? How many centuries of Sith teaching exist solely to chase the kind of power that could grant a mind foreknowledge of its own future?" He spread his hands, an old gesture of persuasion Anakin remembered intimately, remembered succumbing to once already in a life this office no longer quite believed had happened. "Whatever pain drove you to reject that other path, Anakin, I promise you, it need not repeat itself. Knowledge like yours, wielded correctly, wielded together, could reshape this galaxy without a fraction of the cost your first path apparently extracted. I could teach you to avoid every mistake that broke you the first time." For one vertiginous moment, standing in the gravity of a voice that had once, in another life, talked him into burning everything he loved, Anakin felt the old pull, not toward evil exactly, never toward evil in Sidious's careful framing of it, but toward the seductive, exhausted relief of simply letting someone else carry the terrible weight of choosing. 20 years of memory whispered how easy it had once been to let this voice make the hard decisions. How comfortable the certainty of the dark side had felt, compared to the endless, exhausting uncertainty of trying to choose rightly every single day, with no guarantee any of it mattered. He thought of Ahsoka's wary eyes on a rain-soaked ridge, of Obi-Wan's hand extended in the mud, unshaken loyalty offered to a man who hadn't yet earned back his full trust, of Yoda's quiet, patient faith that a single choice, repeated enough times, might eventually become a different kind of man entirely. "No," Anakin said, and ignited his lightsaber. Sidious's expression did not so much as flicker with surprise. If anything, something almost like satisfaction crossed his ancient, patient face, the look of a predator who had, after long and careful consideration, finally gotten the confirmation he required. "Then we understand each other," Sidious said, and Force lightning erupted from his fingertips with a violence that filled the office with blue-white fire. The same terrible power Anakin remembered from a hangar bay decades in a future that no longer, perhaps, needed to exist at all. The lightning hit his blade-first instinct, honed across 20 years of surviving exactly this attack, angling the lightsaber to redirect the current rather than absorb it. A defense Vader had learned at terrible cost, and Anakin now deployed with a Padawan's untrained muscles, doing a veteran's practiced work. Even so, the force of it drove him back a full step, his boots skidding against polished stone, every nerve in his young body screaming with a pain his memory recognized, and his body had never actually endured. "You always did have excellent instincts," Sidious said, advancing through the wreckage of his own office, decorative artifacts scattered and burning where the lightning's overflow had caught them. A pity they never quite extended to wisdom. Anakin didn't answer. He'd learned, across a war's worth of remembered mistakes, that Sidious fed on engagement, on the small victories of provoking a reaction, of shaping an opponent's emotional state to his own advantage one calculated word at a time. Silence was the only defense that gave nothing away. He pressed the attack instead, closing the distance before the Sith Lord could gather another lightning strike, blade flashing in a sequence of strikes that drew on forms Vader had mastered across 2 decades, and this young body had not yet formally learned. A discontinuity that should have crippled him, should have left his technique fighting his own muscles for control, and instead simply felt, disturbingly, like coming home. The body remembered what the mind already knew, adapting with a speed that defied every principle of martial training Anakin understood. Sidious met him with a lightsaber of his own, drawn from some hidden mechanism in his desk, its red blade humming with the particular, corrupted resonance of a crystal bled and broken to serve the dark side. He fought with the economical brutality of Darth Plagueis' old student, decades of hidden practice honed in secret while he wore the Senate's robes in public, a skill set Anakin had only ever witnessed once before in the horrific single duel that ended Mace Windu's life on a balcony that, in this timeline, hadn't happened yet and might, depending on the outcome of the next several minutes, never happen at all. They fought through the office and out onto the balcony beyond it, Coruscant's endless spires wheeling around them in the smog-hazed evening light, blaster fire beginning to converge from the Chancellor's alarmed security detail below, red and blue blades crossing and disengaging in a violence too fast for untrained eyes to follow. Anakin felt the old, familiar cost of sustained combat at this level building in his young, unconditioned body, muscles screaming, breath tearing, a physical exhaustion Vader's mechanized systems had never required him to manage, and understood, with a cold clarity that had carried him through every crisis of this borrowed second life, that he could not win this fight through endurance. He would need something else. "You're tiring," Sidious observed, not even breathing hard. His red blade weaving a pattern Anakin recognized from a memory of watching this exact style cut down a Jedi Master he'd once respected more than almost anyone else in the Order. Interesting, isn't it? All that knowledge, all that hard-won foresight, and still just a boy's body underneath it, with a boy's limitations. "Maybe," Anakin said, finding breath enough for the words between exchanges. "But I know how this fight ends if I keep playing by your rules." He broke off the engagement instead of pressing it, retreating not in panic, but in calculated withdrawal, drawing Sidious forward across the balcony toward the edge where Coruscant's traffic lanes streamed past far below, and in the half-second where Sidious's attention split between pursuit and the balcony's geometry, Anakin reached, not for his lightsaber, but for the Force itself, pulling with everything 20 years of Vader's brute, practice power could summon from a body that had never before attempted anything of the kind. The balcony's ornamental support strut, weakened already by stray lightning damage, tore loose and swung toward Sidious's flank with the sudden, crushing force of a battering ram. It should not have worked. Sidious was, by any reasonable measure, the more powerful being in this exchange. His mastery of the Force, refined across decades Anakin's young body hadn't lived through even once. But mastery assumes an opponent behaving according to expected parameters, and Anakin, carrying a Sith Lord's tactical ruthlessness inside a Jedi's untested shell, had spent this entire duel deliberately, patiently refusing to behave as expected. The strut caught Sidious across the shoulder, driving him off balance at the precise moment Anakin's blade came around in a strike aimed not to kill, some fragile, stubborn piece of Anakin's Jedi conscience refusing that final step even now, but to sever the lightsaber from Sidious's grip entirely, the red blade tumbling from the balcony's edge into Coruscant's traffic far below. Sidious staggered, weaponless, robe scorched, his composed mask finally, fully cracking into something raw and furious and ancient. "You cannot possibly believe this changes anything," he snarled, lightning gathering again at his fingertips despite the awkward angle of his injured shoulder. "I have survived worse than one arrogant boy's lucky strike. The Republic's own Senate would burn this temple to the ground before believing your unsubstantiated accusations over my public record." "Maybe," Anakin said again, holding his blade steady despite the trembling exhaustion in his arms. "But you're not fighting one boy anymore, Chancellor." Below, on the office floor behind them, the balcony doors burst inward, Obi-Wan first, blade already ignited. Mace Windu a half-step behind him with an expression of thunderous, focused fury, and behind them both, small and green, and moving with a speed that belied his diminutive frame, Master Yoda, whose presence in the Chancellor's private office required an explanation Anakin understood immediately and gratefully. Yoda, keeping his promise from months ago to watch, had followed Anakin here, the moment he sensed the confrontation begin, and had not come alone. "Sidious," Windu said, and the single word carried the full, cold weight of a lifetime's suspicion finally, catastrophically confirmed. What followed was not a clean victory. Sidious fought with the desperate, ferocious brilliance of a cornered predator who had spent decades building contingencies for exactly this scenario. And even weaponless, even outnumbered 4-1, he came within a hair's breadth of escaping through means Anakin recognized with horror as identical to the ones he would have used himself in another life. A hostage grab toward a junior Senate aide who'd wandered into the chaos. A desperate Force-assisted leap toward a passing air taxi. Options Vader himself might once have exploited without a second thought. It was Yoda, in the end, who closed the trap, a precise, devastating series of Force manipulations that pinned Sidious against the balcony's ruined edge long enough for Windu's blade to end the confrontation with the same brutal finality Anakin remembered from a version of this fight that had happened years later, on this same balcony, ending very differently. Chief Palpatine, Senator, 22-year Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, Secret Sith Master orchestrating a galactic war for his own ascension, died on the floor of his own office, as the sun set over Coruscant's endless spires, not from an act of desperate self-defense by a lone, exhausted Jedi Master, as had happened in the history Anakin remembered, but from a coordinated strike by an order that had, this time, been given warning enough to act together. The silence that followed felt enormous, disproportionate to the scale of a room, as though the entire galaxy had paused to absorb what had just happened within it. Obi-Wan found Anakin sitting against the balcony's shattered railing minutes later, exhaustion and adrenaline finally catching up with a young body that had spent the last 20 minutes performing feats Vader's decades of experience had demanded of it, without regard for what it could actually endure. Obi-Wan knelt beside him, expression a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and something that looked, unmistakably, like profound respect. "You knew," Obi-Wan said quietly. "This whole time. You knew exactly who and what he was." "I told Master Yoda," Anakin said, too tired now for anything but total honesty. "Months ago. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't risk moving against him without proof, without you, without the Council believing me enough to act together instead of getting picked off one at a time." He looked up, meeting Obi-Wan's eyes directly for what felt like the first time in this entire strange, borrowed second chance of a life. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you sooner." Obi-Wan was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the confession, but everything it implied about the months behind it, the careful evasions, the unexplained instincts. the weight Anakin had carried entirely alone, except for one small, ancient master's quiet faith. "I imagine," he said finally, "that you had your reasons. Whatever they were, I suspect I'll want the full explanation, eventually, when you're ready to give it." "Eventually," Anakin agreed. "Not tonight." "No," Obi-Wan said, helping him to his feet with the same steady hand he'd offered on a rain-soaked battlefield weeks before. "Not tonight. Tonight, I think, the galaxy simply needs to learn how to breathe again." Below them, word was already spreading through the Senate district. Chaos, confusion, the beginning of a political reckoning that would reshape the Republic's power structure for years to come. An uncertain future finally, genuinely unwritten in a way it hadn't been for Anakin since he first opened his eyes on that smoke-choked ridge. He had no memory to draw on for what came next. No hindsight, no foreknowledge, no borrowed certainty from a life that had ended in fire and regret. For the first time since waking in his own younger body, that uncertainty felt less like a threat and more, cautiously, like a gift. Ahsoka found him that night in the Room of 1,000 Fountains, sitting where Yoda had once sat with him months before, watching water fall over ancient stone with an expression she was only beginning to learn how to read. "Everyone's saying you helped stop something huge," she said, settling beside him without invitation. The same easy familiarity that had defined their bond from its very first, strange day. "Nobody will tell me what, exactly. Master Kenobi, just keep saying you'll explain when you're ready." "I will," Anakin said. "Someday. It's a long story." "Is it a good story?" He considered the question with more seriousness than she probably expected. Considered a suit of black armor and a throne room and a river of fire on a world called Mustafar that had, in whatever tangled, impossible way the Force had chosen to grant him this second chance, either already happened once or might now, mercifully, never happen at all. "It's a complicated one," he said finally. "But I hope, it's going to end better this time." Ahsoka studied him with the sharp, searching curiosity he remembered and loved from a life she hadn't lived yet. A bond that existed now on foundations neither betrayal nor grief, nor a black helmet's cold isolation would ever again be permitted to poison. "Whatever it is," she said, "I'm glad you're here to tell it eventually. Weird as you are." Anakin Skywalker, no longer Vader. Perhaps never Vader again, though the knowledge and the capacity for that darkness would live in him always, a scar rather than a wound, allowed himself, for the first time in 2 lifetimes combined, something that felt entirely, unguardedly like hope. "Me too, Snips," he said. "Me too." Far across the temple, in a quiet chamber lit by starlight, Master Yoda sat alone in meditation, reaching out through the Force toward a future that had, for the first time in decades of careful watching, gone genuinely, unpredictably dark to his ancient senses, not with dread, this time, but with something closer to relief. A single thread of destiny had been pulled loose and rewoven by a choice only one being in the galaxy could have made. What grew from it now was anyone's to decide. The war would continue. The galaxy's wounds ran deeper than one Sith Lord's death could heal, and new dangers, some familiar, some entirely unprecedented, would rise to fill the vacuum his fall had left behind. But for the first time in longer than Yoda cared to measure, the shadow he had feared for decades no longer waited at the story's end, patient and certain and inevitable. It waited, instead, wherever Anakin Skywalker chose to walk next, and for the first time that was a genuine open question, answerable only one single ordinary, extraordinary choice at a time.